to the Unseen Podcast, a podcast dedicated to missing people, unresolved cases, and UK true crime. Today we're going to explore the story of Betty Hadden in December 1945. Her disappearance did not initially cause much concern. However, when an arm washed up on the foreshore of Aberdeen Harbour, a large investigation began and left many people wondering what really happened. This episode contains descriptions that some listeners may find distressing, so listener discretion is advised. Aberdeen is located in northeast Scotland and is the third largest city in the country in terms of population. Due to its coastal proximity to the North Sea, it's known for its long coastlines and beaches. The city has always been associated with the sea and has been famous as an important fishing port, employing many workers during the early 20th century and into the present day. In more recent times, Aberdeen has become known for its oil. Oil was first discovered there during the 1960s, and in the 1970s the oil trade became a booming business for the city, with many people employed on the oil rigs today. During the 1940s, the city was like any other during the Second World War, trying to get by during times of struggle. In 1943, the city was bombed by the German Luftwaffe, which caused significant damage to many of the city's buildings and caused 125 deaths. This was named the Aberdeen Blitz. During 1945, the war came to an end, and many cities across the country and the world breathed a sigh of relief and started to rebuild their lives. On the 12th of December 1945, a local man was walking along the foreshore of the harbour, close to an area described as the Navigation Channel. He arrived at some boulders, which looked to be covered in seaweed. As he continued walking closer to the boulders, he realised that he could see something odd lying amongst them. He suddenly realised what it was that he was looking at. It was a left forearm and hand. This was not what he was expecting to find and was shocked by the discovery. He immediately contacted the police and they travelled out to the scene. Officers arrived at the foreshore and located the arm and hand amongst the boulders. It was unusual just to find an arm, so they began to scour the beach for sign of any other body parts that may be in the area. The arm appeared to have been severed from the body, and there was a piece of string tied around the wrist. The difficulty that they faced upon the discovery was that the foreshore was vast, and due to the nature of the beach, it meant that the body parts could have come from a number of places, including being washed up from further afield. Despite this, Aberdeen City Police were quick to act and sent out several parties to search the area that the arm and hand had been found. Officers wore Wellington boots and looked amongst the rocks and flotsam on the beach in the hope of recovering more body parts. They also sent out another party of officers who searched the docksides in the surrounding areas, while another group searched a nearby beach close to the pier. It was thought that there could be evidence recovered from any of these sites due to the tides. Where had this arm come from? It was evident to the investigators that the arm appeared to have been dismembered and did not look like it had been simply due to decomposition. This was a concern, and it meant that CID officers were quickly involved in the investigation. The only evidence that the police had were the arm and hand, and on an initial cursory examination, it was clear that whoever this was had not been in the water for too long, owing to the amount of decomposition observed. This did narrow the time frame for where this victim may have gone missing and been killed. Medical officers were brought into the case to analyse the remains and attempt to give an estimate of who the victim may be and when they died. It's reported in the Aberdeen Press and Journal on the 13th of December 1945 that medical opinion was that the arm belonged to a female of at least 18 years of age, and that she had been deceased for only a few days when the arm was discovered on the beach. This was useful information for the police as it gave them some indication as to who they were looking for. The why, how and who of the case, however, was not as easy to establish. It began to get dark on that first day of the investigation, and it was decided that they would resume looking for any more remains or possible links to the victim the next day. The following day, the local newspapers once again ran stories about the victim found on the beach, except this time they had a name for her. The police had managed to make a breakthrough very quickly in the case. In just 4 hours, they had identified the female as 18-year-old Elizabeth Betty Hadden. This breakthrough was made rapidly due to the fact that they had her hand as well as her arm. The officers were able to use the fingerprints on the hand and check them against the fingerprints that they had already on file at the police station. This led to a match against Betty, as she had once been arrested for a minor offence. This allowed them to formally identify the remains as Betty's. This was certainly a positive start to the investigation, and newspapers labelled the discovery as clever police work and a brilliant start. It was also established that the medical officer's initial examination of the remains had been very accurate. The difficulty now in the investigation was to try and establish who Betty was and what had led her to be found in this tragic situation. Betty lived at 9 Manor Walk in Aberdeen, a tenement building around 5 miles from where her body was eventually found. She lived with her widowed mother and her 5 younger siblings. Betty was a somewhat transient young woman who worked a number of different jobs: a kitchen maid at a hotel, a waitress, and working in factories. Her most recent employment had been in September 1945 at a fish curing factory. However, this had only been for 4 days. Employment was difficult to come by in 1945, and it's reported that Betty often had to leave the area to find work. It was known that her mother often struggled to make ends meet with her large family, and it was often easier for Betty to leave to find work rather than be a burden on her. Neighbours at Manor Walk, where the family lived, described Betty to the Aberdeen Evening Express on the 13th of December. One of them stated, "She often came to my house to smoke a cigarette and have a chat or to read a book. I would describe her as a wayward sort of girl, and a strong-willed girl. She gave me the impression that her reason for going away, which happened only when she was out of work, was that she didn't want to be a burden on her widowed mother, who had 5 young children to look after." She went on to say, "Betty has no friends that live around her. Her companions were all girls from the town, but she never said very much about her affairs. She always seemed to be most unsettled when she was out of work." It was clear that the fact that Betty may have been murdered and her body parts found had caused a stir with the neighbours where the family lived, and they were shocked that this could have happened to her. It was evident that when the police spoke to her family and those that knew her in the area, that lack of work was a preoccupation for Betty, and she would often leave home to find employment. When they spoke to Betty's mother, she stated that she had been away from home for 10 days at the point where her remains had been found. The news of her death devastated her mother and siblings, and they couldn't understand how this had happened. Tracking down Betty's movements in those 10 days that she had been away from home was now the priority for the police. The problem was that as Betty lived a transient lifestyle, it may be difficult to pinpoint her exact locations during this time. By contacting those that knew Betty, officers found out that she had last been seen by family members on Friday the 7th of December, 5 days before her remains were found on the beach. Relatives told police that she had gone to visit them at their home in the area of Torry. Torry is a few miles from Manor Walk, where Betty lived, and is also located close to where her remains were discovered. The relatives stated that they had last seen her at 3 o'clock that Friday afternoon. There was no information about where Betty was that weekend. However, they did receive a tip from a witness who said they saw her on Monday the 10th of December, just 2 days before she was found. It was reported that she was spotted walking along Castle Street in the centre of Aberdeen at 10:40 in the evening, along with 4 other girls. This was just 1.5 miles from Torry, where she had previously been seen just a few days before. police made an appeal to the 4 girls to come forward to speak to them about that evening. It stated in the Aberdeen Evening Express on the 14th of December, "If Betty Hadden is the victim of a shocking crime, murder and dismemberment of her body, it was committed sometime during those 36 hours, in which no trace of her has yet been found. Any information to narrow that time gap will be of great value to the police in their investigations." Following on from this appeal, the police received another tip that enabled them to create an even more detailed picture of Betty's evening on that Monday night. The witness stated that they came forward after seeing the picture of Betty in the newspaper. They said that they had seen her at around 10 o'clock that night, about 40 minutes before she was seen with the 4 girls. She was at a telephone box on Castle Street, however she was not alone. She was with 2 sailors. One was described as being much taller than the other one. The witness stated that she continued to watch the group as they crossed the road. She said there was something about Betty's face that made her continue to watch them. However, by this point, the witness had got onto a tram car and it had set off, meaning she couldn't see them anymore. If the witness' statements were correct, Betty had left the 2 sailors and met up with the 4 girls she was then seen with. These witness statements seem to suggest that Betty was in the central Aberdeen area late on the Monday evening and certainly gave the officers some leads. While they continued to try and track down the people who had been seen with Betty that night, the investigators also resumed their search along the foreshore and in the area where it was believed Betty may have gone missing. This included the Balnagas golf course that overlooked the sea, around half a mile from where Betty's arm had been discovered. The golf course had recently been occupied by the military, and some of the huts were still located there. This was in addition to the many searches done on the foreshore, as new tides brought in more objects from the sea. Unfortunately, despite the thorough searches, no further body parts were found. Some rags and fabric that appeared to have come from clothing were recovered and taken into evidence. However, it was difficult to establish if any of them were relevant to Betty. As the hours ticked on in the investigation, it started to look likely that Betty had come to some sort of foul play, and medical officers set about trying to establish the type of implement that had possibly been used to sever her arm. Less than a week after Betty's remains had been recovered, the officers received a new tip that narrowed down the time frame even further. It stated in the Dundee Courier on the 17th of December that a man came forward with information about Betty. He explained that around 12:45 a.m. and the early hours of the morning on Tuesday the 11th, Betty approached him asking if he had anywhere she could stay for the night. He told her he didn't, and then Betty told him she knew a woman who could probably give her some lodgings for the night. He then stated she walked down Upper Kirkgate towards George Street. This was just half a mile from Castle Street, where she'd been spotted around 2 hours before. This meant that the time frame for Betty's murder was now somewhere in a 33-hour window. This seemed to corroborate the new medical information that suggested Betty's arm had been in the water for no more than 24 hours. The time frame became even more narrow when further witnesses came forward. A female friend of Betty's spotted her on Constitution Street in the centre of the city at around 12:45 on Tuesday afternoon. The woman's explanation is documented in the Aberdeen Press and Journal on the 18th of December. The article reports, "A woman friend stopped and spoke to her. Betty Hadden said she was looking for a book. The woman's impression was that the girl was waiting for someone and was undecided as to which way to go. The woman said bye to Betty, to which she replied, 'Cheerio.' This was quite a crucial piece of evidence, as the woman knew Betty personally, and it was thought it could be relied upon as a credible sighting. 2 further men came forward to explain they believed that they saw Betty at around 7 p.m. on that Tuesday night. The men said they were coming out of the Bonaccord Hotel bar in Market Street in the city when they spotted a girl who they now said looked like Betty. They noticed her because she appeared to be trying to get the attention of 3 sailors by giving them the glad eye while standing on the pavement. The men, however, did not notice if any of the 3 sailors stopped to speak to her. If this was a credible sighting, it meant that Betty was alive as late as 7 p.m. But it also meant for the 2 days before her death, she was here, there, and everywhere in the city centre. Her movements, while contained within the centre, were quite erratic, and meant that she could have disappeared from anywhere. One lead that the police wanted to follow up with was that one of Betty's friends, Sheila Stewart, had been seen in Aberdeen on the Wednesday that the remains were found. It was hoped that she may have been able to shed some light on where Betty may have been in the gap in the timeline. The investigators came across a problem, however. They now couldn't find Sheila. When they searched around Aberdeen, she couldn't be found. It's reported that she was eventually tracked down in the city of Perth, 90 miles away from Aberdeen. Sheila had been in Perth since the early hours of the morning on Tuesday the 11th of December and had arrived there by lorry. This meant that the sighting of her in Aberdeen on the Wednesday was not correct. It also meant that she couldn't shed any light on Betty's movements during that crucial window on the Tuesday afternoon and evening. The police continued to issue appeals to the public, stating that the last credible and confirmed sighting of Betty was at 12:45 that Tuesday afternoon, given that the men who thought they saw her in the evening didn't know her and had made the connection only after seeing a photo of Betty. While the officers combed through witness statements to try and locate Betty's final movements, her remains were being examined. It was reported in the Aberdeen Press and Journal on the 15th of December that Professor Sydney Smith from Edinburgh University had been brought in to analyse the arm. Professor Sydney Smith had become famous for his involvement in the Jigsaw murders case involving murderer Buck Ruxton. In 1935, physician Buck Ruxton had murdered his wife Isabella and their housemaid Mary Jane, before dismembering their bodies and dumping them in Dumfriesshire, Scotland. We have covered this on the podcast last year, and I will link the episodes in the show notes if you're interested and haven't already listened to it. Professor Smith was one of the experts involved in the analysis of the body parts and their eventual identification. He became involved in the case of Betty Hadden with Dr. Robert Richards, who was a lecturer in forensic medicine at Aberdeen University and a police surgeon. The experts confirmed that they believed the arm had not been in the water more than 24 hours, and that it must have been deposited at some point on Tuesday evening. The question of who could have been capable of committing this horrific crime was looming over the officers, especially as it would have took someone with expertise in that area to dismember Betty's body. This was something learnt in the Buck Ruxton investigation, as he was a trained doctor. It was hoped that if the remains had been deposited in the sea, then they may eventually wash back up. Investigators continued to search the area around the foreshore, and 8 days after the discovery, the navigation channel was dragged to try and locate any remains that may be in the water. This, however, did not yield any results. The police began to focus their attention on the area of Torry, located close to the key area of the foreshore. Due to the proximity of the neighbourhood, officers believed that perhaps Betty may have been in that area before her death. The search was thorough, and it's reported in the Aberdeen Evening Express that every street, lane and close were cordoned off. CID officers combed the area, working systematically through every street to try and find any evidence related to Betty. This was a major undertaking, as there were hundreds of buildings and also outbuildings to search. Police commented on the search, stating, "We shall go through Torry yard by yard." They didn't, however, publicly say whether they were looking for anything specific or were merely working on a hunch. As Christmas Eve 1945 arrived, so did a new discovery. Just before 2 o'clock on the 23rd, 2 Coast Guard workers, James Robertson and John Sinclair, were scouring the beaches close to the area of North Haven, around 30 miles from Aberdeen city centre. As they were watching the coastline, the 2 men spotted a human leg that had washed up amongst the boulders. It appeared to be intact from the thigh to the foot, However, it was difficult to establish on first glance whether it belonged to a male or a female. Of course, there was an immediate connection between this discovery and Betty's death, and there was the hope that another of her body parts may have been found. The Coast Guard had been on high alert around Aberdeen, and although it's not uncommon to find bodies of persons who had been lost at sea, the link to Betty was impossible to ignore. The leg was quickly taken to be examined by medical officers. It only took a day for the examination to be complete, and on Christmas Day 1945, the findings were reported in the Aberdeen Press and Journal. The leg did not belong to Betty Hadden. It was in fact a man's leg that had been in the water for several months. The police stated that there was nothing suspicious about this discovery, and it appeared that it belonged to a man who had been lost at sea, as the leg seemed to have become detached from the body while in the water. This did not help the investigation and also brought up the very sad fact that many unidentified people end up in bodies of water, particularly by the coast. The difference between the man's leg and Betty's arm was the fact that her arm appeared to have been severed with an implement, rather than just being the result of movement in the water. There was also the fact that it was known that Betty had been alive the Tuesday before the remains were found. She had not been in the water long, and her body would not have had the same amount of time to decompose. The police had now focused their search on the area of Torry and the time period of between midnight on Tuesday and 5 a.m. on Wednesday morning. The police had received further information from the community in Torry about several screams that were heard in the early hours of Wednesday morning. CID issued a statement about the tip that they received, stating, "Information given to the police over the last few days has established that about 2 a.m. on Wednesday the 12th, screams described as being made by a female in terror were heard by several people at different points in the Torry district. The points from which the screams were heard strongly suggest that they came from the area within the Mansfield Road, Victoria Road, St Fittick's Road and the south side of the River Dee. If the person who screamed was not Betty Hadden, it's of vital importance that the police should learn who that person was. A strong appeal is made to anyone who can help clear this matter up to get in touch with CID as soon as possible." The police also made an appeal for anyone that was driving a car in the area in the time frame to come forward. There were reports of cars in the area between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m, and the police wanted to identify the drivers and perhaps eliminate them from their inquiries. The police appeared to have narrowed down both the area and the time period that they believed the murder had occurred, but sadly this did not lead to any new information coming in the case. As Aberdeen saw in the new year, the police continued to search for new information and some tips did come in. In January, officers came across some new information about two youths that were possibly connected to Betty in the days before her death. One youth reportedly delivered a note from Betty to one of her friends who was at a dance hall on Monday the 10th of December. He got the note from Betty at Little John Street and took it to her friend at around 9:30 p.m. There was also another youth described as being present, and it was thought that he had been seen with Betty on Friday the 7th of December. One was described as being around 16, thin and around 5 feet tall. The other was around 15, thin with small features. It was thought that he was wearing dungarees. The police were interested in speaking to these young men, as it was thought that they may have information about Betty's whereabouts in the days before her death, and possibly information about her future plans. In an effort to further narrow down her movements in the evening of Tuesday and the early hours of Wednesday, the police carried out some tests in the area of Torry where they believe she may have been. It's reported in the Aberdeen Press and Journal on the 17th of January that the police waited for the conditions to be similar as the 12th of December, before tasking a woman to reproduce the screams at various points where it was believed Betty may have been. Police officers stood at the areas where witnesses had reported hearing the screams and listened to see if they were audible. CID officers stated that the tests confirmed that they'd been right with their hypothesis, and they did indeed come from the area of Torry that had previously been pinpointed. A CID official told the newspaper, "We feel that there are still some people in Aberdeen who can help us in our investigations. To them, the information may appear of no value, but to us it may be of vital importance." Police continued to be hopeful that they may solve the case. However, as 1946 progressed, it was clear that the investigation was coming to a standstill. In February, police issued another appeal, this time for help creating some replicas of bangles that Betty owned. The bangles had been given to her by a merchant seaman in summer or autumn 1945, and it was hoped that they would be valuable to the investigation. They appealed for the seaman who gave them to her to come forward, and described the bangles as clear perspex, one with pink streaks running through it and one with blue streaks. The case appeared to have hit a stumbling block, and the officers were unable to get any further information to help solve Betty's murder. Over the following decades, Betty's death was referred to in several newspaper articles over the years, and was not forgotten about by the local community. The sad truth was, there was a distinct lack of evidence about what had really happened to her. The known information appeared to show that Betty had last been seen officially on Tuesday by a female friend at around dinner time. There is then evidence to suggest that she'd travelled to the Torry area of the city, which is where screams were heard in the early hours of the morning. Her arm and hand were recovered on Wednesday amongst the boulders, and seemed to have been severed from her body using some sort of implement. As far as I can tell from the research, whatever this implement was has never been established or found by the police. The rest of Betty's body was never recovered, despite thorough searches of the areas where she was found and checks on ships. The suggestion at the time was that Betty had been murdered due to the way in which the arm appears to have been removed from the body, and the fact that the rest of her remains were never found. Betty was described as being transient, and the fact that she didn't stay in one place made it difficult for the police to track down her movements, or the people she spoke to along the way. Betty's case is still classified as a murder and is unsolved, however remains open as nobody was ever convicted for the crime. There are many questions that still remain about the case. Who murdered Betty? Where was it committed? How was it committed with no trace ever being found? And where is the rest of Betty's body? Due to the age of the case, it's evident that the lack of forensic techniques may have had an impact on the conclusions that were drawn. I have to say, after researching this case, I was both saddened and surprised at the same time. As horrific as the crime was, I was pleasantly surprised by the amount of effort that went into trying to solve Betty's case. In the cases of transient young women that I've covered, I've always been concerned about the lack of care and attention that seemed to go into the investigations. However, I cannot say this is what happened here. The officers seemed to go above and beyond to search for Betty and to appeal for information, and they also worked with the community to try and gain new leads. Despite the sad end to Betty's case, it did make me happy to read that the officers seemed to care about her and tried to find her justice. I never give up hope in these old cases that a discovery may be made, despite the years that have elapsed, and I continue to hold out hope for Betty Hadden. Thank you for listening to today's episode. Please let me know what you think about Betty's case. Thanks to everyone that continues to support the podcast, and thank you to our Patreon supporters. If you want to receive ad-free early access episodes, bonus episodes, shout-outs and stickers, the link is in the show notes. You can also help by simply reviewing the podcast wherever you listen, or by following us on Facebook, Twitter or Instagram. Thanks to Addicted to J for your lovely 5-star review this week. I also have a YouTube channel where I upload audio from the cases, so if you want to subscribe over there and have a listen. If you have any suggestions for cases, please send them in to me at theunseenpod@gmail.com. I hope everyone's keeping safe, and I'll be back with you next week. As always, thanks for listening. I'm Caprice, and this has been Unseen.